Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes. So great to have you here as always, and also great to have Taylor Hagood on the show today. He is a professor of English at Florida Atlantic University. He is a literary critic, an internationally renowned scholar on William Faulkner, and as an author, he has numerous books to his credit, including the one with a title that got me to reach out to him. It's a subject I've always wanted to cover on the show, Stringbean, The Life and Murder of a Country Music Legend. I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. It is such an honor to be on this podcast and to be included with so many illustrious writers and illustrious books, and some of the recent ones particularly have been exciting for me. So I'm very honored to be a part of this, and thank you so much for this invitation and opportunity.
Thank you for those kind words. So your new book is a bit of a departure, right, from the subjects you usually write about. What was it about the story that you connected with?
Well, that is true. I have spent most of my career thus far writing books of literary criticism on William Faulkner and Southern literature, African American literature, and those kind of things. But long before I was a literary critic, I was interested in old country music. I started playing the banjo when I was about 12 years old, and the guitar and the piano, and I had a lot of interest in music. And I found out about Stringbean when I was a kid, probably about 12 years old or so. I saw a picture of him in an old book, and then I pestered my parents into taking me to the Country Music Hall of Fame. And there I saw his banjo. I didn't know at the time that it was a very particular kind of banjo, but I saw it there in the Country Music Hall of Fame, and it just spoke to me. The head was worn away from where he had been playing in the particular style he played, which was a clawhammer, or what he called a rapping style. And I was so fascinated with that instrument. And then I remembered my parents as a kid. I remember my parents talking about his having been murdered. And so that was really the beginning of my interest in him. And I had seen, when I saw that picture of him, I thought, wow, this guy is so strange looking. He has this long torso and these little short legs. And I thought, what is the deal with this guy? Then later on, about the time I was promoted to full professor, I was really interested I've been reading a lot of biographies, and I wanted to change a little bit of the direction of my writing. And I ran across a video of Stringbean, and I thought, hey, I remembered him, and I thought I would like to read a book about him, but there really wasn't one. There was a book that had been written in 1975 about the investigation of the murders. And I managed to get a copy of it. It's not easy to get copies, but I managed to get a copy, I think, on eBay. And I read that very quickly, but it left out so much. It didn't have anything really about the trial. It really told the investigation from only one viewpoint, from one of the viewpoints of one investigator. And then it really did not give much of Stringbean's life. And so I thought, I guess I'm the guy to write this book. And it really set me on a journey that was very unique. It was a journey that took me through writing a biography and true crime. And trying to stitch those together was pretty difficult. So not only content-wise, but even style-wise, writing for a general readership, and also trying to put together two really very different stories, and yet two stories that need each other. They can't quite stand alone, you might say, by themselves. So you have to put them together. So that's kind of the history of how I got into this project.
So Stringbean's real name was David Akeman. He was born on June 17th, 1915, in rural Kentucky. What were things like for him growing up in that part of the country?
Well, I appreciate that question very much. It's a very fascinating part of the country to this day. In fact, if one were to drive there, one would find that the cell phone reception is not very good. And if you go to the Dairy Queen in the town, you're liable to hear country music from the 1950s. It feels like a place that's kind of from another time, really. And in his time, in Stringbean's time, of course, he grew up right. Right, he basically was born right into the teeth of the United States involvement in World War One, and of course, he grew up throughout the 20s in that part of the world. And while the rest of the country was booming in some ways, and at least parts of it, I don't know that Kentucky necessarily, or at least that part of Kentucky necessarily felt that. But certainly with the coming in of the Depression, with the beginning of the Great Depression, Stringbean and his family were very poor, and they benefited. They did benefit from the New Deal, but like a lot of people in the rural South or rural Appalachia or the rural part of the South, they faced a lot of poverty. And he came of age, like a lot of people in that time, not trusting banks. Of course, many banks had failed. And so he and actually his future wife both were, like a lot of people of that generation, tended to be distrustful of banks, and they wanted to keep cash and use cash and be very frugal in their lives. So that was a very shaping influence. That was an influence or a situation, I guess you could say, that shaped him very much early on.
Right. You write that as a boy, he had kind of a reputation for being a little lazy.
Right. So one of the interesting things about doing the research for this book is that a lot of people who knew Stringbean when he was a kid are no longer around. I mean, practically nobody is still around who would have known him as a kid. But what I would find is that just asking around and getting to talk to different people in the area and family members, but particularly people in the area, he did seem to have a little bit of a lazy streak. He seemed to be a little more interested in playing music or going fishing. He loved to go fishing. That was something that followed him through his entire life. Wasn't maybe so much into the work of the farm, the kind of tasks you do all day, every day. And of course, the part of Kentucky he was in remains very agricultural, and tobacco would have been grown. And that's one of those 13-month out of the year crops. And there are a lot of steps in it and stages in it, and it's hard work and trying to grow corn. These are not big fields. This is mainly hilly, borderline mountainous areas, frankly. And I think he was somebody who really was more interested in playing music. He learned to play the banjo initially, mainly from his dad, and he loved to play music. That's what he enjoyed. Loved to go fishing, and not really so much of a farm working kind of a guy. Even though when he grew up, he would buy land. He did have a tractor, and he did allegedly or somehow or another, he must have worked the land, I guess, but he was never really known for being a very dedicated farmer. And I think he did seem to have kind of a reputation for being a little on the lazy side. And I think this caused some friction with his father pretty early on, in fact.
Right, yeah. So not only did his love of music come from his father, like you said, but it also came from the radio.
Yes, sir.
What kind of music was he listening to, and who were some of his early influences?
Well, the influences, there were a few. There was his father. His father was the main influence, and he was a banjo player, and he was known to play in a clawhammer style. But also in that part of Kentucky, there were a number of people playing a two-finger picking style with the banjo. So a lot of people know the three-finger style that's so common in our time, or clawhammer is pretty common too. But the two-finger style is not maybe as often practiced, but he did learn that apparently from some people in the area. But he also did indeed have an influence from listening to music, particularly on the radio. He was a huge fan of a man named Dave Macon. Usually his stage name was Uncle Dave Macon. And of course, his name is very similar. Dave Macon and David Akeman are very, very similar, and people in his life would point that out. But he was a huge fan of Uncle Dave Akeman. Macon playing the banjo, and he would listen to him play on the Grand Ole Opry, which was on WSM, and started in 1925 when when David Akeman was still a little kid. But it was a big, powerful radio station, WSM, and it went all over the South. and he was able to listen to it. And like a lot of people in that part of the world, he grew up essentially listening to that music, and he was particularly fond of Uncle Dave Macon, who had had his own interesting career. He had been in transportation in Middle Tennessee. That had been his career, and that became obsolete. He did mule transportation. He would use a mule power, I guess you could say, to haul materials in the Manchester area in Tennessee. And he essentially became obsolete with the internal combustion engine, and he didn't really have much interest in those machines. So he said, that's not for me. And instead, he took up a career in entertainment. So much like Jimmy Rogers, the country music father, who also had been involved in the train. He was a train guy, and he left that to become an entertainer, mainly for health reasons, it seems. But both of these gentlemen started that kind of entertainment career, in the case of Uncle Dave Macon, very late in life. But he became a big star, and David Akeman, or Stringbean, became a big fan of his, and allegedly was telling his brother that he was going to be, and his family, that he was going to be playing on WSM someday when he grew up also.
So one of the New Deal programs that David is able to take advantage of is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And as he works for them, he continues to develop his banjo skills until he's finally able to get onto the radio, right?
Well, it's an interesting story. He was in a CCC camp, and he got word of a banjo contest that was being held in McKee, which is the county seat of where he was living, Jackson County, or at least where he was from. And there had been a number of banjo contests and other contests in Kentucky at the time, but he participated in it, and he did not win it. He did not win the contest, but he did participate, and he impressed the gentleman who was putting on the contest, a guy named Asa Martin, who was coming down out of Lexington. I believe the radio station there was WLAP, if I remember correctly, and he went anyway. Asa Martin invited David Akeman up to Lexington, and he went up there. Even though he didn't win the contest, he was hired to play the banjo, and Asa Martin called. This is where he got his name. Actually, is the name Stringbean. Asa Martin couldn't remember this kid's name. He remembered hiring him, but he couldn't remember his name, and so he just said, "Come on up here, Stringbean, and play us a song." And Stringbean, David Akeman, of course, a very tall kid, thin kid. He looked kind of like a Stringbean to him, I think. And now, early on, though, Stringbean was promoted or advertised in the plural. He called himself Stringbeans sometimes also. In fact, that happened a lot throughout most of his career, actually. You would even later in his career, one would see him referred to in the plural. But it was that singular form that stuck, I think, because it was, I think it was more evocative.
And later, he would become Stringbean, the Kentucky Wonder, right?
Yes, right. That's a brand. That's a strain of Stringbean. So that's the Kentucky Wonder Stringbeans. If anybody listening in is a gardener, you may know that particular kind of. I think it comes both as a pole and a bush style of bean, but they're a good type of Stringbean, the Kentucky Wonders. Yeah.
So at some point, pretty early on, right, he starts to take on this comedic persona,
right?
This hillbilly hayseed character.
Absolutely, yes, sir. Yeah, pretty early on, and he wasn't alone in doing that, but I think people who were doing that kind of role were channeling certain other kinds of performances, even including the minstrel performances. And in fact, Stringbean performed in blackface early on. So I think there's been some interesting scholarship done along these lines, people tracing out how poor white performers, or as you say, hayseed or hillbilly, the big term at the time was hillbilly music. And there was actually a lot of controversy at the time, because a lot of performers who were playing hillbilly music did not want to play up the hayseed image. So they would dress in suits and ties, or in the case of some people like Bill Monroe, who was the founder of bluegrass music, he would make sure that all of his band members would wear, of all things, jodhpurs and riding boots and hats and ties. And it was very important to them to not to look countrified. But a number of performers also found out pretty soon that from a marketing viewpoint, they could actually get noticed more, get more traction by dressing up really even in exaggerated outfits and playing that role. So there's some interesting photographs of some early string bands, we would call them roots bands, or string bands, that you'll see a picture of them dressed up in very nice clothing, suits and ties, and then others, or dresses or whatever, and then others, they'll be in these hayseed kinds of outfits. And that was an issue, and it has been for a long time, or was, I think, for a long time, kind of an issue in country music. I think there was a lot of tension about that. But Stringbean, interestingly, embraced that image pretty readily, and especially as he delved more into comedy. Even when he would attach himself to various bands, he would look different. He would dress different in a different way than they did. So he kind of played all that up, and he played the country thing up. And of course, the people who have continued that, they're the famous figures. Minnie Pearl would have come around the same time. Later on, Archie Campbell, but then even later on in the 1990s, the Blue Collar Comedy Tour, and those people, Jeff Foxworthy and others, and even into our own time, there are a few maybe who still do that kind of thing. But anyway, he did embrace, yes, the comedy and really delved into that, or made that part of his persona. So he was kind of a triple threat. He became a singer. The singing seems to have come along a little later, but he was a banjo player, singer, and comic. And above all, he was an entertainer. And that was really what he had gotten from Uncle Dave Macon more than anything else. Uncle Dave Macon was an entertainer in his own moment. And by the way, one can find a video or two still of him, some footage of him twirling his banjo and so forth and so on. He was not necessarily the best singer. He was not necessarily the best piano player, but he was really entertaining. And Stringbean really followed in those footsteps. David Akeman really focused on that, being an entertainer. And so those different elements of it, the comedy and the banjo playing and the singing, those were all what made that work. And it involved physical as well as, verbal comedy.
What's an example of a funny bit he would do as this character?
Well, that's interesting. So partly as he went along, but certainly when he developed his very famous costume of a very long shirt with very short pants, the physical comedy, the look alone, I have to tell you, Eric, it is amazing the impact when I go to places and show pictures of Stringbean. I'll do a lecture or something like that, and I'll just put a picture of Stringbean up there in his costume, and people just start laughing. It's hilarious. It's just amazing that it still has this impact. So part of it's physical comedy, and he had ways to milk that. He would dance a little jig, and he would do certain things to play that up. As far as the verbal comedy, he had a bunch of, frankly, corny jokes that he would tell. Probably his biggest thing that he got a lot of mileage out of was his letter from home. So he would write these letters, fake letters from home, as if his family was writing to him, and they would say things, all different kinds of jokes about, well, it's actually kind of nice here not having you around, stuff like that. Or there would be, again, a more kind of corny kind of joke, but that would be mainly probably his foremost thing. But he had a very dry wit, and a lot of his comedic impact would have been in the moment. It would have been on the stage with a certain kind of look and a certain kind of dry humor that, hit the audience in the moment. He was very good at that off-the-cuff kind of comment. In fact, I'll tell you one of those. There's a singer named Whisperin' Bill Anderson, and he is absolutely a legend in our own moment, but he was very young when Stringbean was in middle age, and he came on the scene, and he and Stringbean and the singer Patsy Cline and some other people were making a road trip for one of the what they call the Opry package shows. And they all got to laughing. Patsy Cline and some of the other people in the car got to laughing about something. And Stringbean looked over to Whisperin' Bill Anderson, and he said, "Billy boy, I think these folks have gone crazy. And then he looked at him and he said, and Billy boy, sometimes I'm not so sure about you either. So it was this kind of off the cuff kind of thing usually that sort of represented his type of humor. Very dry wit, very quick kind of humor, and very in its I hate to use the word milieu, but in its moment, I guess you would say would be how it worked.
You mentioned this in your book, that his outfit with the short pants and the long torso, it had a passing resemblance to a zoot suit,
Yes.
which was made popular by black singers in the 30s and then became part of Mexican American culture as well. And Stringbean's outfit was basically a countrified zoot suit.
Yes, sir, absolutely. I think he was drawing from that kind of look. And I think that one of the things actually I tried to find was more connection, I should say it this way, more evidence, I guess you could say, of influence, African American influence in his life. I mean, direct, like pointing out specific people, because this is very doable with Uncle Dave Macon or Bill Monroe or a lot of figures. You think about Elvis Presley or somebody like that had all that influence. And I think it was there for Stringbean too, but I was not able to uncover those direct influences. But I think that indirectly, these influences were all playing a part. There was a country music figure at the time who had a little bit of a similar outfit, but he didn't have the long torso. That look is very, very much out of the zoot suit style. So yeah, I think it's kind of indirect. And he was also drawing from this kind of Emmett Kelly or Poirot kind of sad clown kind of figure. He would paint on his eyebrows would be painted on in a kind of a sad clown look. So he was drawing from a few sources. I don't know how conscious he was of them all the time, but essentially he was drawing on those. But yes, there was definitely, that was a look of the time, the zoot suit, and it was almost like his take on that, I think.
We will be back after a brief message from our sponsors. And we have returned. So his first break, right, was when he began working for one of the Monroe brothers.
Right, yes, sir. Yeah, Charlie Monroe. Charlie and Bill had been a duo at first, and then they kind of split up, and Stringbean got connected with Charlie Monroe. And I wouldn't say that he made a big name for himself, but it definitely was. He graduated into the major leagues, we'll say it that way. Charlie is kind of an interesting story that I guess is runs us a little too far afield, but it's a kind of an interesting story with Charlie and Bill because there was a lot of rivalry between the two, and Charlie kind of managed to get a foothold in Wheeling, West Virginia on the Jamboree there, WWVA 1170 AM radio station there, and but even in his moment of triumph, Bill Monroe kind of bested him by getting on WSM, and it was kind of an interesting story to where Bill Monroe's star just continually rose throughout his career, where Charlie's faded. But it was definitely the big leagues at the time, and Stringbean being able to get on there with Charlie Monroe, playing in North Carolina primarily, that was a big step for him. It would not have been his big break out in a big way to the public, but it definitely set the stage for him.
So he keeps moving up in the world of country music. He plays on the Grand Ole Opry for the first time. He leaves Charlie Monroe and becomes a bluegrass boy with Bill Monroe. And this is when Stringbean really starts to make a name for himself and starts rubbing shoulders with country royalty.
Absolutely. That really is true. And when it's with Bill Monroe that he gets onto the Grand Ole Opry for the first time, and he does. And in some ways he becomes country music royalty, Stringbean. But this is where he meets his idol, Uncle Dave Macon, and he really becomes very close to him. And Uncle Dave Macon takes him under wing, and he becomes a regular on the Grand Ole Opry. Eventually he goes off on his own. As a solo, first as a kind of teamed up with another singer, and then ultimately as a solo act. And, he was somebody that his coworkers loved him. His colleagues in the country music industry absolutely loved this guy. One of the most interesting things to watch, and anybody can go on YouTube and watch this, if you really want to understand the impact of Stringbean in his own moment, turn on one of those shows later on in the 1950s or 60s with Porter Wagner or the Wilburn Brothers or Dale Reeves, and the people, or Scruggs and Flatt Scruggs, anybody, they all love him. And even people who would not necessarily get along with each other. There was something about David Akeman that everybody loved the guy. He had no enemies, which is quite a thing to say. But he really didn't have any. But yeah, that was when that's when he broke out into the scene. And it was a great moment because this was when the Prince Albert Opry segment had begun and the show was really becoming entrenched. And he was right there with it. Stringbean is really one of the foundational figures of the industry in that sense. And he's still recognized as being so.
So as far as his non-musical life went, he served in the Second World War. He was married, divorced, and then married again. And the second time, his marriage was to the love of his life, Estelle.
Yes, sir. He was not in Europe, but he was in the Army for a little while, and he was married first to a lady in Kentucky. And by the way, I just brought to light, and I suspect there'll be more of this moving forward, that the official, I just discovered, somebody brought to my attention, and I never could find it during the time of writing the book, but somehow or another, somebody stumbled across a note in a newspaper that his divorce was on the grounds of abandonment, cruelty and abandonment, which I think is sort of the canned term for he was spending all of his time at the Grand Ole Opry instead of at home. Not to make light of the divorce, but I think that's kind of what that meant. But anyway, he did then meet the lady who seemed to be the love of his life, a lady named Estelle Akeman, who was from Middle Tennessee. And he did get married, and this is who he was married to throughout the rest of his life. Who by the way, was with him everywhere he went. So I guess she decided, okay, he's not going to go off. We're going to go. If he goes to the Grand Ole Opry, I'll be there too. And by the way, he never drove anywhere, so she did a lot of the driving.
And they didn't have children, right?
No, sir. No children.
So at some point, he purchases some acreage outside of Nashville, and he does this with fellow country music singer Grandpa Jones.
Yes, sir. Grandpa and Ramona Jones and David and Estelle Akeman were very, very close. They were very much peas in a pod, as they say, and they bought a fairly good number of acres up there, over 100, about 140 acres or so. And they had houses right together. And when I say the houses are right together, I've been there. I've stood right in Stringbean's house and looked right at the house that the Joneses lived in. And I would say the distance between the houses is probably not more than 15 paces. They are literally right beside each other. And they were very, very close. And this was in Ridgetop, Tennessee, which was north of Nashville, about 20 minutes north of Nashville.
What kind of home did the Akemans have?
Well, David and Estelle Akeman had a very, very tiny house. I would imagine it couldn't have been over 600 square feet, maybe something like that. Basically two rooms. As far as I can tell, as far as I know, I don't think they actually had indoor plumbing at the time. So it was a very tiny house, and David Akeman was quite tall, as I mentioned earlier. I can tell you, standing on the back porch of that house myself, I'm only about 5'8" or so. Even I had to kind of bend over to get underneath the eave of that back porch. So he would have been really having to struggle to get, he'd had to duck pretty far to get under there. But they had that tiny little house, well, we would call it probably a tiny house. And then the Joneses' house was a bit bigger right next door. The Akeman house was red, the Joneses' house was white. And they had a cave. They actually had a cave, kind of a famous cave back behind the house. It's now a famous cave. A lot of caves in that part of Tennessee, Middle Tennessee. And anyway, and then they had those two houses. There was a cave in the back and a sort of a spring coming out of it. And then both mainly hills, but also some pasture land. They did have a cattle gate. As for whether or not they had cattle, it seems maybe they may have actually had cattle at one time or another, but at the time of his death, I don't believe there was any. I'm not aware of any mention of them having it. But anyway, so that was basically what it is: rural, out on a rural route. So maybe, hopefully, that describes it well enough. You have to drive pretty far on a driveway, kind of a gravel driveway over a ditch, and then up to it to get to the house.
Yeah. So the 1950s come and go, and with it, the era of Elvis.
Oh, yeah.
Rock and roll becomes popular. And into the 1960s, country music starts becoming more mainstream. But Stringbean is still an old-timey act, right? How does his act adapt, or does it?
Well, it's interesting. It kind of doesn't. In a way, the currents of music strangely end up adapting back to him. Really, Stringbean, he was somebody who didn't really change much. That was another thing about him. I think he was a kind of an anchor. He was definitely a bridge in the country music industry from the earliest days until the time of his death. But he was, at the time that Elvis sort of hit it big, obviously right there in the middle of the 1950s, Stringbean was on a touring with a kind of a traveling circus kind of a thing. In fact, an interesting little detail is that the guy he was working with at the time, named Tommy Scott, actually tried to hire Elvis Presley, and that didn't work out. They couldn't agree on the price, so they just had this guy, Tommy Scott, had another fellow who was already working in that group just grow his hair out and dress up like Elvis, and basically present himself as a kind of an Elvis impersonator. It's a kind of funny thing to think that Stringbean and Elvis types were both these very strange looking figures were touring at the same time. Elvis was so strange in his moment. If you go back and look at those Ed Sullivan shows and you see the acts, the very buttoned up acts that were being performed at that time, and then you see Elvis come out with his shirt unbuttoned and his eyeshadow on and his hair gleaming. He looks like somebody just came from Mars. And it was sort of a couple of strange looking fellows really doing this show. And it was a time when you had Pandit and Vampira and Liberace and all kinds of colorful figures on TV. And so it was a kind of an interesting moment. But Stringbean, in a way, just dug in, really. He was somebody who dug into the old-time act. Unlike some people who really tried to change, he really didn't. And he got connected with a recording label, Star Day in Nashville. And, they dug into recording the old-time music. They found a market for it, especially for adults living in rural areas, and they started selling these LPs, these long playing and even super long playing or extra long playing albums. And they knew that they liked that, and Stringbean had enough of a following from the Grand Ole Opry to make that work. But it's an issue in a way. Country music always has this, and it becomes an issue about every decade that country music has to figure out how to keep its roots but still remain relevant. For somebody like Stringbean, he was a guy who, in a way, was older when he was younger. He was an older kind of a guy. Grandpa Jones is the same way. He was calling himself Grandpa Jones when he was in his 20s. And it was a great marketing plan because he could never outgrow it, never get too old for it. But unlike, say, Frank Sinatra, who by the time you get to the late 60s and early 70s, he's trying to figure out how to stay relevant. Dean Martin famously knocks the Beatles out of number one with Everybody Loves Somebody. They're all trying to figure out how to stay relevant. In a way, Stringbean just kind of dug in. And because he was so frugal, he could get by without really making that much money, really, even though he wanted to have $1 million. But anyway, he just kind of stuck with it. And then things began to turn back his way, most significantly when in the late 1950s and certainly in the 1960s, the folk music scene came into being. And suddenly people like Pete Seeger, who is strangely parallel in some ways to Stringbean, but many others really began to promote the kind of music that Stringbean had been playing all along. So he ends up becoming relevant all over again. What's old becomes new again for him, and he becomes very relevant, and he finds an audience. One of the really interesting moments is his going to the University of Chicago to play the Chicago Folk Festival, and you can see a picture of him. I wasn't able to get a good enough quality picture to include it in the book, but there's a great photograph of him in the old program from the year he was there, and he's dressed in a kind of an edgy little outfit. He's not wearing his accustomed costume, but something that makes him look a little more beatnik, actually. So in some ways, it's an interesting thing how he manages to stay relevant and yet really without changing really that much at all. And in fact, maybe the best example of this, I don't mean to give too long an answer to this, Eric, but maybe the best answer to this or example of this kind of thing would be his record, That Crazy Vietnam War, which is kind of like a protest song, but it is just a rehashing, just sort of repackaged protest song that he had been singing that was from the World War, like all the way back to the Spanish War. It was a very old, all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt, basically. So this was a kind of a good example of his way of just keeping to the old, but, finding ways to represent it, I guess you could say.
Sure. And he becomes a regular on Hee-Haw in the early days of the show. So people across the country definitely knew who he was. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to go back to this lifelong mistrust he had of banks. He of course lived through the Great Depression, so it's understandable. He saw what happened to the banks in 1929, 1930. But as someone who came from a poor family and whose goal it was to make $1 million, Stringbean, once he reached that level, readily and openly bragged about how rich he was. And he would pull thousands of dollars from his wallet, right, apparently to show off. And his friends became deeply, deeply concerned about his loose relationship with money.
Yes, sir, absolutely. This is all true. And so some of the people I got to talk to, the late Mark Jones, the son of Grandpa Jones, really stressed the point you're making, that Stringbean's fans and friends, including Grandpa Jones, were very concerned about his doing this practice, this thing of carrying the cash around and keep it in his overalls pocket. I think he saw it as a kind of a joke, Stringbean, but according to Mark Jones, the son of Grandpa Jones, he said, listen, my dad was constantly telling him, you're going to get yourself killed someday doing this. And he was not the only one. I also had the honor of speaking with Ronnie Stoneman, who was part of a family called the Stoneman family. And by the way, they were another interesting group that would, in the 60s, would be doing a TV show wearing go-go boots and all that, but playing basically country music and old folk type music. But anyway, I remember talking to Ronnie Stoneman, and she said same thing. She said so many times, listen, Stringbean, I'm worried about you carrying this money around. And she actually visited the house, and Estelle, Stringbean's wife, told her and showed her cans, vegetable cans and so forth that had money in them that they kept in the freezer. So they kept who knows how much money. I would just say about this that Stringbean was known to carry as much as $5,000 on him in the early 1970s. Is a lot of money. And also, though, he may have had as much as $20,000 or more dollars in the house at any given moment. I've talked to the current owners of his house, and they've had some interesting things to say even about that cave in the back of the house and some things there that might suggest even that there might have been some money kept there. So who knows? It's hard to know for sure. I will say this, despite all the talk about banks, they definitely kept some cash in a strong box in a bank. And the family lawyer, I had the pleasure of talking to him at one point, and he was talking about counting that after their deaths. And then there were claims at the time of the murders that they had some money. The Akemans kept some money in some savings accounts too. So who knows where it all is? Who knows how much money they actually got? Allegedly, Stringbean claimed he did hit the $1 million mark. I really don't know. It is hard to know those things, of course. But anyway, that was very much the thing. And this news got around town. it got around Nashville. And Nashville had been getting rougher anyway. The Grand Ole Opry, the Ryman Auditorium was downtown, and of course, people can visit there today, and parts of the year the Grand Ole Opry is still held there. But at the time, in the late 60s and early 70s, there were a lot of prostitutes around, a lot of drug addicts, a lot of just people, people would be standing in line to go to the Opry, and they're being accosted, and this is really what drove the building of the new Opry House out on the edge of town where there were not these sort of rougher elements. So Nashville had become pretty rough really by that time.
So would you walk through with us November 10th, 1973, the final day of life for Stringbean and his wife, Estelle?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. It was a pretty cold day, and it was a Saturday, and it was getting toward the end of the college football season, and I believe Vanderbilt, if I remember correctly, I think Vanderbilt was playing in town in Nashville that day, and the temperatures had fallen. Stringbean would have gotten up and cut some firewood that morning. His neighbor remembered going out and cutting firewood with him. He had a chainsaw from another country music comedian who was from Yazoo City, Mississippi, named Jerry Clower. And Jerry Clower would tell a story about a guy named Marcel Ledbetter that attacked a county line joint with a chainsaw. And so the McCullough Chainsaw Company gave him some promotional chainsaws, and he gave one to Stringbean. And so Stringbean would have cut the wood with that. And then later on in the afternoon, he and his wife, Estelle, drove in their car. They drove a Cadillac. They actually had a station wagon that was their everyday car, but the one indulgence, the one thing they splurged on was that every year they traded in for a new Cadillac, and they would just start the mileage at zero, and then at the end of the year they would write down the mileage and use that for their taxes. And they thought maybe the Cadillac sort of lived up to maybe their seeming like big stars. He even wrote a song called Herding Cattle in a Cadillac Coupe de Ville, kind of a joke song. This particular Cadillac was green. And anyway, he put his banjo in there, and he carried also a little .22 revolver. And they headed off to Nashville, and they played that night. And he was introduced by Tex Ritter, the father of John Ritter of Three's Company of fame and other things. And Tex Ritter introduced Stringbean on the Grand Ole Opry that night, and he played some numbers to big applause. And when it was over with, he left early because the next morning he was going to be getting up and going to Virginia. Grandpa Jones, his buddy, was going to drive him up to the state of Virginia, and they were going to do some hunting up there. That night during the Opry, his wife, Estelle, backstage was talking about how rough Nashville was. You never knew when somebody was going to knock you in the head and take your money. And so there had been some talk about that. And Ronnie Stoneman and Little Jimmy Dickens, both, they had maybe a premonition, they claimed. At least later they said that they had a premonition that maybe Stringbean was going to be in trouble that night. And he said, well, you don't need to worry. I got my pistol down. I got my friend here in my pocket. Anyway, they left that night, and they headed back up, left the Opry early, and they headed up to their home. And then they had an encounter. And they got home probably earlier than the people who were waiting for them expected them to get there. But anyway, there were people waiting for them, and there was shots were fired. And within a short period of time, Stringbean was killed, shot through the heart, right directly through the heart. One time, only one shot. And Estelle seems to have run from the house, appears to have been running away from the house. She was shot in the back of the head and also in I believe it was the left arm, if I remember correctly. And then the bodies were found the next morning by Grandpa Jones, who got up kind of early in the morning and drove over. He didn't live next door anymore. He had moved this time a little bit farther away, but he drove over to pick up his friend, and he noticed there was no smoke curling out from the chimney. Stringbean would get up and build a fire every morning, and there was no smoke from the chimney, and he knew something was wrong. And then he saw Estelle's body in the field there right by the cattle gate, and then he hurried out to the house and saw that Stringbean was lying face down Well, I think when they found him, he may have been he was face down, face up. I'm trying to remember if he was face down or face up, but anyway, he's lying across the floor right in front of the fireplace there.
Back after this quick break, and we have returned again. Yeah, I think the photo in your book showed him face down.
Yeah, that picture may have been taken after the police had turned him over, actually. But anyway, that's what I can tell you for sure. Now, as far as what exactly happened that night, there are 2 or 3 different stories. It's not entirely clear, maybe who all was actually there, but there was certainly a story that developed that has been accepted as the standard story. And of course, I'm glad to talk through that if you would like for me to.
Yeah. I definitely want to ask you about that. So the police arrive, and word of the murders spread within the country music community and well beyond. Stringbean's friend Roy Acuff gets to the house before the police even do, in fact. And when the house is searched, there are cigarettes, beer cans,
Right.
2 different calibers of bullets found. So based on this evidence, what is the initial theory about what happened to the Akemans?
Well, I think the whole thing was pretty baffling to them at first. They were trying to figure out, one of their first things was try to figure out, how many people were there. And so they looked at the different types of cigarettes and tried to decide. I think they were not clear. I think they thought that maybe there was more than one person involved. The beer cans were a sign. Also, that was a tell because Stringbean had some beer. They had been drinking his own beer, but there were some cigarettes and so forth that seemed to be kind of a tip off toward multiple people being there. So they tried to make sense of that. They also confronted kind of a difficult scene in terms of the metal that was there, I guess you could say. So there were a number of 22 rounds, but one of the things that was a little bit difficult is that there had been a shootout at that house several years earlier, and the police would not have known that going into it. So trying to figure out which bullets were fired when and where and how and so forth became kind of an issue. But anyway, it was there were 22 casings, and then there was a 38 that rolled out of Stringbean's clothing. I asked a gentleman one time about that. I thought, well, isn't that kind of weird that it would have gone through his body and not like that it would have been trapped by his jacket? I would have thought that bullet shot at a close range would have lodged in the wall or something. But anyway, this gentleman I was talking to was fairly expert on ballistics, said, no, that could happen. So when they turned Stringbean's body over, this round sort of rolled out. But anyway, yes, there were a number of different casings there. And from that, they began to try to piece together. And one of the things they decided is that maybe, by the way, none of Stringbean's own guns, and he had quite a few, none of them were in the house. They had been taken. Grandpa Jones provided, I should say, the information of what kind of guns he had. And the police began to think that some of those shots were probably fired by Stringbean himself, so that there was maybe a shootout that night. It looked like maybe Stringbean had a scuffle. He had a bruise on his knuckle, one on his knee, suggesting that he had maybe thrown a punch or something. So that, they were trying to make sense of that, but there were a lot of things that didn't make sense. They had a K-9 unit that followed a trail out on the field up to a house and then lost the trail. The Akemans' station wagon had been driven to a nearby quarry and abandoned, and the police were trying to find something there. So they were as far as the evidence, and then there was the problem of all the press, the country music, as you mentioned, Roy Acuff, and there were a number of other country music figures there. But the press, I think there was a helicopter out at one point, but there were a lot of people on the ground, and there was a lot of evidence probably destroyed in the process. This is one of the things that Tommy Jacobs believed or noticed or saw when he was doing the investigation that day. So it's a little bit confusing. It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what all was there, but they basically, I think by the end of the day, the investigators had decided there was more than one person there. I think they already believed there was a shootout, And then they had decided that the motive was money because number of the country. One of the problems too was they couldn't. None of the country music people could think of the Akemans having any enemies. So because they couldn't think of that, they couldn't figure out why in the world anybody would have killed them. So, but they did tell the police about Stringbean having money, having cash on him, and that's led the police to think that this was about money, even though there was $3,000 on Stringbean's body and $2,000 on Estelle's. And this is sort of the rub of the whole case. If it's done for money, why was that money left behind? On the other hand, no mention was ever made of any money left in the freezer or anywhere like that. So, was there money taken from the freezer? Or was that just a myth? Did that even happen, or had that happened at one point and not at the time of the murders? So there was a lot of confusion about it, and they didn't really know who to even to begin to question. They had two people, including one of whom was Stringbean's neighbor, and who had been helping him cut wood that day. And the two of them, or he and this other guy, were kind of suspects. But really, I think the police didn't really think there was much there. Really, overall, the sense that I got from everything I could read about it, everything I could learn about it, was that by the end of the day, there were probably many more questions than answers by the end of that first day. However, it was only a day or two later that this news broke, and the country music industry was terrorized and terrified. And the city of Nashville suddenly had to face the fact that it had big city problems, and it was very devastating. And you'll still hear people talk about that in Nashville or in the country music industry. But anyway, it was the case that a day or two later, an anonymous call was made to the Nashville Tennessean newspaper with a person saying that he had committed the crime, that he had been at the scene of the crime, and his partner had killed Stringbean with his own gun. So that was about what the police had, I think, in the first couple of days of the investigation.
Right, yeah. Stringbean had rigged a makeshift burglar alarm, right?
Right. That's what one of his colleagues said. I have to tell you that in the process of doing the research for this book and doing the writing, I must confess that I found that to be kind of hard to verify. Oscar Rollins, a colleague of Stringbean's, claimed that he did have this kind of a string, literally a string strung across the cattle gate, and that if it was down, that would be the tip-off. And so it makes sense that is what happened, and that's how Stringbean would have known. The idea was maybe that he knew there were people in the house, and that string being broken is what let him know about it. It could be that. It's a little bit hard to say, though, because the murderers actually ended up parking on the road out from the house, and then they walked around from behind. So they went to the back door. So I don't know if that quite nails that down, So I guess for me, I'm a little bit, personally, I should say, not totally sure about that. But that was the claim, that he did have a very low-tech, what would you call it? I can't think of the word, a security device, I guess. But that was the claim.
Yeah. So there is a huge funeral. All the country music stars pay their respects.
Yeah, the funeral was very big. In fact, Ronnie Stoneman had told me at one point that she personally remembered not only all the country music people all these famous country music people being at the funeral, but also just regular everyday people. She particularly remembered firemen lining up the road all the way up, going toward where they're buried, which is not too far from Ridgetop. A cemetery. They're buried in the same cemetery where a number of other country music stars are buried. And but there were a lot of just regular everyday people who lined up to see the hearse drive by, the hearses.
Yeah. So it's November 14th when the police get a pretty big break in the case. You write that a man named Felix Elliott, in jail on an arson charge,
right,
reveals some interesting information, evidently in an effort to lessen his own troubles.
Yeah, he was already in custody, and really this at this point suddenly the story shifts in a way toward a totally different cast of characters. Felix Elliott being one of them, saying that he had heard some people talking about committing this crime, not necessarily murder, but going and robbing a country music star. And it's interesting because at this point, there enters into the scene the district attorney at the time, who was a guy named Tom Shriver, who was an interesting guy. So the trial has this kind of John Grissom-y kind of feel about it, because Shriver was he had dark hair, and he kind of wore these horn-rimmed glasses, and he was kind of a good-looking guy. He would sort of put you in mind of sort of a Sherlock Holmes-looking kind of profile, maybe Basil Rathbone type of profile, and he had this, I don't know, kind of a way about him. He was a politician. In fact, I didn't mention this in the book, but he was actually up for re-election that year, and so he had quite a bit of motivation to make this work. His dad was actually from a place called War Trace out in Middle Tennessee. And, he kind of grew up in the country, and he had established himself. I think he was involved with the Garden Club in Nashville and so forth. So they were kind of Nashville, kind of lately established Nashville establishment. They weren't old Nashville money, but they had kind of settled themselves into Nashville. And he was a guy who had gone to Vanderbilt. And I think he was pretty well ensconced in the Nashville scene. He loved bluegrass music. He played in a bluegrass band. And he really involved himself in the trial far more than would have been normal. So it was a kind of an interesting kind of a situation, because, the situation with Felix Elliott is that he was connected with this family called the Browns. And really he was connected in a lot of ways with Charlie Brown. That is literally the guy's name, Charlie Brown. And he was a guy, he was a welder. He had a welding business just up the road, really, from Stringbean in Greenbrier, Tennessee, not very, very close to Ridgetop. And his brother's name was Doug Brown, and he worked for American Marine Company with his cousin, John Brown, as in the John Brown who was involved in the activities right before the Civil War. So these names are pretty sort of strangely basic and yet strangely iconic. Anyway, this Felix Elliott knew them, and he had heard talk of they're looking to commit this crime. One of the things, though, that is maybe not always so evident is that Charlie Brown actually was quite involved in the country music industry. So he and his wife had a booking agent, a talent agency, and they were known to have had lunch with Stringbean and Estelle not long before the murders. In fact, there have been claims that, and I didn't put this in the book, but I've discovered since then that I've been looking for some kind of evidence. I still haven't nailed it down, but I've heard some talk since then from some people who would know that, in fact, Charlie Brown had booked some dates for Stringbean. So, that's a connection. It's not as if, the rumor got out about Stringbean and then these couple of ne'er-do-wells committed this crime. The Charlie Brown connection is kind of intense, actually. And in fact, Doug Brown, there was mentioned at one point in some of the documentation during the trial, there had been, during one of the little depositions, there had been mention that Doug Brown had been out on Stringbean's property welding. So it kind of raises an interesting question about, was Stringbean surprised? Was he really surprised by who was at his house that night? Or did he expect them to be at his house? What all's involved there? At this stage of the game, I have no way of knowing. At this moment in time, I have no way of knowing. But there was a lot of talk that there was a yellow truck at the house that night, and Charlie Brown had that kind of a vehicle. So anyway, but that Felix Elliott said there had been talk of that, and it was serious enough talk that the police believed they had something. Now, by the way, these investigators were under incredible pressure. They were under incredible pressure from the country music industry, from Nashville, from all kinds of directions, and they definitely wanted to make sure and have somebody, they wanted somebody that they could look to. So they brought the Browns in. They brought John, Doug, and Charlie. I think they may have brought Roy in. That's another one of the brothers of Charlie and Doug. Anyway, they brought them in, and as soon as they got there, and I think probably this was one of the biggest tip-offs for the investigators, is that once the Browns got downtown to Nashville at Metro, at that point, Charlie Brown had the prescience and the know-how and the money to hire the most expensive and successful defense lawyer in the city, a guy named Joe Binkley. And Joe Binkley cost, $3,000 up front cash. And he had made a career out of representing, as they say, widows at Belle Meade, whose husbands had conveniently died, And he was a guy who, that was it was a lot of money up front. And I think that the seriousness of it tipped off the police. I think they thought, now, wait a minute, how does this guy with the welding shop have the cash to pay this guy? How does he have the know-how to pay this guy? And so Charlie Brown proved to be very formidable, but I think this was one of the tip-offs. Now, I can tell you from my viewpoint, one of the questions that remains in my mind is just how much money was taken the night of that murder. It's a very fascinating thing that Charlie Brown, there was $5,000 left on the corpses, but Charlie Brown had enough money to pay cash up front for Joe Binkley, and he had enough money to build himself a new welding business building after this. So, where did that money go? Was there any taken or not? Who knows?
Right. And another man named Bill Downey comes forward. He actually just kind of shows up at Stringbean's house while the police are still processing the crime scene. And he reveals some really interesting stuff, right?
Yeah, he does. Boy, this guy. Again, listen, man, it's like a cast of characters. This guy was a rounder. He was a strange guy. He came in and had this information, and then they were having some plumbing problems in Stringbean's house, and he allegedly fixed them for him. And there was something about him. And this is one of the things that's hard to read through it's kind of hard to read this through the court records, but it's very clear. When I say it's hard to read why this happened, but for whatever reason, the investigators really took to this guy, Bill Downey. I really don't understand why. There was something about him that tickled them, that made them laugh, I guess. And they just always thought he was kind of funny and kind of a goofball, I guess. And I don't know, for some reason, they liked him and they trusted him. And maybe if I had been in the house with him at the time, I would have thought the same thing. I don't know. It's hard for me to see it. To me, he just looks like a sort of another one of these outlaws, but later on in the trial, he would show up with stolen boots. He was wearing stolen boots, and he didn't even realize he was wearing stolen boots until he had sort of forgotten that they were his stolen boots. And then when he remembered it in the courtroom, he was kind of trying to hide them. And somehow the police thought that was funny. So, I don't know, like maybe 1972, 73 is a different moment. I don't know. But anyway, whatever the case, they believed in him, and it was the beginning of a beautiful relationship, because he started coming in and telling them all these things that Doug was allegedly saying, and that Doug was talking about everything he had done, and that Doug had told the details of the story. And over the course of this time, there developed what has become the standard story of the Stringbean murder. And then that was later written down. But anyway, he became the prime informant, and the police definitely, they trusted him, even though he seems to me to be not altogether trustworthy character, but they believed him, and it certainly was in their interest too, and that they started to tell a certain kind of story. I think what was interesting, though, is that it was very clear that the Browns themselves were strategizing. Now, I want to make something really clear. Obviously there may sound like a certain suspicion in my voice. I have no doubt at all that Doug and John Brown were at the scene of the crime that night. I don't have any doubt about that. And as far as kind of what happened, it may well have happened the way they said. But it's an interesting thing that I would say this. Were they the only people there that night? That I'm not so sure of. But who knows? There's no way to prove it either way. And there are a lot of reasons to doubt that maybe Charlie would have been there, because surely that would have come out. But But Charlie was a pretty scary character as the investigators started to dig into his life. He was known for other armed actions and so forth. So he was a pretty tough customer, and he clearly had some kind of pull in the country music industry and, in and around the Nashville area. So, but Bill Downey, so my point in all this is that it's very clear that the Browns themselves were strategizing, and it could be that they thought, okay, we're not going to be able to get out of this without we're going to get convicted sooner or later. It's probably going to be a trial. How do we kind of set this up in a way that can hopefully get everybody out of trouble? I think that's how they were thinking. So, what role did Bill Downey play in that? Did Bill Downey, was he really doing this informing and nobody knew it in the Brown bunch? Well, it could be. Absolutely could be. But when the more one looks at it, the more one kind of wonders a little bit about that. But anyway, that was Bill Downey, and he became really the main informant for this thing. And the police really began to develop this story. The story that they developed was that there had been, Stringbean and Estelle had surprised John and Doug Brown. John and Doug Brown had come that night to rob the house, to burglarize the house. They couldn't find the money, and so they sat down, drank Stringbean's drinks, smoked cigarettes, millions of cigarettes, and turned on WSM on the little white radio to listen for when when the Opry would be done, so they'd be ready for when they came back. But Stringbean and Estelle left early. They came back and surprised these fellows. They had a shootout, and John was the one. John and Doug's decided inexplicably to change weapons that night. John took Doug's gun and Doug took John's gun. No reason ever given for why that happened, but that John shot Stringbean first and then went out and shot Estelle. Doug was just kind of wrestling with Stringbean, and John shot Stringbean and went out and killed Estelle and came back kind of laughing demonically and saying this was like being in Vietnam, where he had been, by the way.
He had chased Estelle, shot her.
Right.
And then when he caught up with her, she then in turn begged for her life.
Right.
And he shot her execution style.
That's the story, and the evidence does bear that out. I mean, who knows what she said, but yeah, that does bear that out. Yeah.
Oh, poor woman.
No, it's a terrible, terrible, grisly murder and scene. Terrible.
So John Brown's attorney, Arnold Peebles, enters the picture.
Right.
And not only does he want to enter an insanity plea for his client, but John Brown also makes the claim that Charlie was the mastermind behind the robbery.
Exactly.
That he had set up the whole thing. That he had given them $100,
right.
But that $100 was basically an advance payment for committing the crime.
Right. That's how John saw it. John understood it to be that way, or at least that's what he said. And he claimed that Charlie had given them a couple of pills. And now, by the way, these fellows, John and Doug, were known, the way they spent their Saturdays is they got to drinking whiskey and riding around the countryside. That was pretty much a normal Saturday for them. But that he claimed, John, that Charlie had given them a couple of pills and that John had passed out. And then when he woke up, they said that he had committed this crime. Now, it turns out that when the insanity portion of the trial, that hearing, when the insanity hearing was done, there was quite a bit of testimony from John's family that he had experiences of committing violent deeds and blacking out and not remembering them. So, that was in the background for what it's worth, who knows. But now Arnold Peebles, he's another interesting character. He's sort of the exact opposite in a way of Thomas Shriver. He didn't go to Vanderbilt. He went to the University of Tennessee Law School. He was a lot scrappier. Shriver was a little more genteel. Peebles, he was a lot scrappier. He also had substance abuse issues. In fact, he had worked at one point for Thomas Shriver and he had actually been let go of for alcoholism. And so by the time of the trial, he was actually hooked on cocaine, certainly by the summer, probably already by the insanity hearing stage, which was in July, but even definitely after that. He was an interesting guy. He's someone that if you listen to attorneys who remember him, they really have a lot of admiration for him. He was a larger than life character. I think they saw him as being very brilliant, and he was trying certain things that were rather novel. He certainly wasn't the first person in history to present the matter of insanity, but the hearing, the particular way the hearing was done, was a little bit unusual, mainly because kind of the roles of defendant and prosecutor were kind of reversed. But anyway, he had an idea. He believed that Charlie had done it, that basically he and Doug were setting up their cousin, John. They were, that because John was such a stinker. And I think they thought, I think probably they thought maybe the strategy was that they would be able to get John out. If they could get the insanity thing to work, that would get him, like, in other words, say that Doug didn't have anything really to do with it. He was just there, and that John was blacked out. And so as a result, basically, and then Charlie had gotten immunity. He had done a plea deal basically to get immunity. So I think that was their strategy. That's what I think was going on. And I think probably Arnold Peebles, but Peebles basically wanted to pin the whole thing on Charlie, not just as the mastermind, but even as the trigger man. He saw Charlie as the trigger man.
One more quick break, a word from our sponsors. And we have returned for the final time. Then Doug, out of the blue, offers a bombshell story to a local reporter, right?
Correct. So there were two major newspapers in Nashville at the time, the Nashville Tennessean, which is still around, although it's now owned by USA Today. And then the other one was called Nashville Tennessean, was the morning paper, and the afternoon paper was called the Nashville Banner. And there was a reporter for the Banner named Larry Brenton. And Larry Brenton was summoned, allegedly, at least to, Joe Binkley apparently set it up and summoned him, that is Larry Brenton, to the workhouse. That was where Doug and John both actually were being held at the time, kind of like a jail in Nashville. And he summoned him, and then Doug gave, yes, as you say, yes, a bombshell confession. And this was where you really get the official story. And one of the prosecuting attorneys working with Shriver was named Hal McDonough, and he says, I had the great honor to talk to him. He's the last person still from that trial alive. And he told me something interesting. He said Joe Binkley had done this before, basically had one of his defendants give a confession to a newspaper reporter and put it in the paper, and then he would use that confession as a way to get the voice of the defendant on the record in the trial without actually having to put the defendant on the stand. So the story went into pretty big detail. It's written in third person. In fact, I had thought at one point about maybe including that confession in the appendix because it's a very interesting document. It's very sympathetic in a way with Doug, even though the story is hair-raising. But it's a story that kind of exonerates Doug in terms of the murder part of it. He was definitely up to no good, but John comes out as the villain and Doug comes off as a kind of a hapless accomplice, But yes, that came out in the newspapers, and it was a huge deal. I mean, it was, and many people, I will say this, I think for many, many people, many readers, and I think since that time, many people have thought, okay, this is the confession story. The story is over, But from the viewpoint, I think, of the lawyers, particularly Joe Binkley, he saw it as more of a strategy for getting Doug a lighter sentence or whatever he hoped to get.
Right. And then at one point, members of the press go out. Was it with Doug?
So this is, so they don't go, Doug, I think, stays put, but they do go out to the pond. There was a pond out not far from, like basically close to the Browns farm. And this is where they had taken the bag of materials, Stringbean items that Stringbean had, his papers and so forth, and also the murder weapons, and thrown them out there. And they go out there, and periodically Larry Brenton and Sherman Nickens stop, and Larry Brenton's trying to find his way out there, and he makes phone calls, mysterious phone calls, and nobody knows who they're made to. And I wish I had been able to include really, again, maybe in a different edition or something, I might include an appendix, because it's really interesting in the trial to listen to this part or read this part in which basically Brenton kind of consults and tries to figure out what he can and cannot say. When you read between the lines, it seems pretty obvious that he's talking to Charlie on the way out there, who's guiding him to the pond. And then Charlie shows up right after they arrive. And essentially, over the next day or so, they fish out these bags that belong to Stringbean. And this confirms, that they're there. But they never found the murder weapons. The murder weapons were never discovered. To this day, the murder weapon, but really neither one. There was a shotgun and a .38. Neither one has ever been discovered, which is a mighty curious thing.
Yeah, one of the interesting photos in your book, part of what was in that bag was Stringbean's costume, right?
Yes,
including his glasses and his hat. And someone took a picture of the outfit all sort of laid out on the grass. And it looks like Stringbean is laying there, but without his body.
Yes, sir. If I just would like to pause for just a moment, Eric, and I hope we're doing okay on time. But if I may just say, I don't want to interrupt what we're saying, but I just want you to know that how much I want to say this way. Your questions and your close reading of this book mean the world to me. I just want you to know that the nature of your questions, the way you framed them, and the details you picked up, and particularly that picture, which for me was so moving and so haunting, and it was something that I've hoped very much that other people, that readers would pick up on. And the fact that you have, and really all the questions you've asked and the way you've asked them, have really blown me away. I feel very honored and very grateful to know that somebody who reads as carefully as you do has read this book. And I hope that comes across in the spirit I mean it. As I'm sure you know, it's so much work. It's a lot of work to do what you do. It's a lot of work to do, as you know, the writing and the podcast. It's so much work. And for somebody to be so on the details as you are, means the world to me. So I want you to know how much I appreciate that, if I may be allowed to say it.
Oh, because, that's nice.
I'm blown away.
Thank you for the compliment.
No, the compliments to me, and I really, to the book, I appreciate it very much. I mean it as a compliment to you, but I guess I'm the one that feels very honored, and I just wanted you to know that.
So, that's nice of you to say. Yeah.
But anyway, but sorry, just to address that picture. Yeah, that to me, it's one of the most haunting things when I ran across that picture. That two of the most, well, obviously the pictures of unfortunately, Mr. and Ms. Akeman dead on the floor, in the field and on the floor, obviously are terrifically haunting pictures. But two of the most haunting photographs that I came across that I was very happy to be able to include were the one of the gentleman putting the banjo away with, there's a group of them. It's almost an Iwo Jima-like kind of pose where they're putting that Vega No. 9 tubaphone away, those Stringbeans in the car. And then the other one was the one you're talking about, that where they laid out his outfit. And it's Stringbean, because Stringbean was this persona. And David Akeman, his relationship to Stringbean, I think, was a very fascinating one, and one that's not easily parsed out. But to see Stringbean, the character, laid out on the pavement, but deflated and empty, there was something about it that it was just so haunting to me, and it remains so. It's probably the most, in a way, the saddest thing to me, and yet also the most it's very essentially Stringbean in a way, that persona. The idea of that persona being, in a way, something you can't kill. You might can deflate it, but you can't kill it. And I don't know, it's a very haunting photograph. So I appreciate you very much, all the work you do, as I say, writing or podcast, the work you do in so many ways, but also your reading, your close reading is something that I want to say on behalf of any writer who has the privilege of you reading their book and talking to them about it. I want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. So the evidence in this case was pretty overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Stringbean's guns, the ones that were stolen, were all tracked down and linked to the Brown family.
Yes.
There is no question at all about who did this, right?
No, no, no. There's no question that the Browns did it. None at all. It had the question of how many of the Browns did it, maybe, but not the question that they did it at all. It's as you say, it's overwhelming. When they said here where the guns are, that's where they were. You know what I mean? So it was an overwhelming case. It was a foregone conclusion. I mean, when they brought the guns out and they had a diver who was down in there also part of the time. And when the guns were produced and the bags were produced of string beans stuff, it was a foregone conclusion with the trial. And of course, the trial was held in Nashville. Everybody in the whole city knew about it. The judge was a guy named Cornelius, and he didn't. He was very. He not only did he not want to have the trial anywhere but Nashville, but he was very comfortable inviting the press in. So it was really a very. There's a sense in which the whole thing was a kind of a spectacle, in the sense that the punishment, everything about it was played out very much in the public eye. That is to say, the identifying of the murderers and all of that. It was very public in a way. So I think there was a type of spectacle in it, and what I mean by that is I think the spectacle, to some degree, I think that spectacle to some degree served the function or the purpose of expiation, kind of a cathartic. It had a cathartic role. I think there was a sense in which this trial was a trial, but it was also a public catharsis. And the contrast between, in other words, it had a cathartic role, and the contrast between the Akemans, who were just so expressly innocent, and the Browns, who were so manifestly evil, drew the whole scene in such a strong and sharply contrasted way that the story became almost a kind of a story that, I don't know, it became like a story that had like big universal implications. It was a classic story of evil versus good. And I think that registered not necessarily consciously for people, but looking back upon it, it's very evident that was at work. That this was a case of evil people who represent an evil moment in the city, murdering in a brutal way the most innocent. This wasn't George Jones. This wasn't anybody who was getting in trouble. The Akemans were peace-loving, quiet, innocent people, and so that was the effect of it, and it was archetypal almost in that sense.
Yeah. Do you think the Browns, in whatever manifestation of the family was present at the house, do you think that they went there with the intent to kill the Akemans all along? Or do you believe that when Stringbean began shooting at them, that was what sealed their fate?
Well, I think this is another great question. And of course, I don't know how to answer it. Obviously, I know, according to John and Doug, they would claim that it was the shooting Doug claimed that the Stringbean shooting is what created the shootout, that they didn't mean to do anything. But the reality is they showed up with weapons. Doug and John Brown showed up with weapons. Obviously, you can perform an armed robbery, I guess, and not be intending to kill somebody, and things can get out of hand. I know that is something that can happen, but I would say this: I don't know. There's some curious things there. There are some mysteries there. actually. I mean, to me, one of the questions is, did Stringbean and Estelle know that there was going to be somebody there meeting them that night? The answer seems obviously to be no, but I really don't know the answer to that. You know, I'll tell you something interesting. Stringbean gave an interview the night that he was murdered. There was a reporter named Stacey Harris who did a taped interview with Stringbean. And, you know, he was looking back over his life during that interview. At least when she published an article based on it, he was talking about looking back over his life and what he had done and so forth and so on. And, you know, that tape is not available. That tape is, you can't get that tape. So, you know, I don't know what's on there, you know, but it's held in a certain repository and it's not available to the public. So what does that mean? You know, I don't really know. Can just tell you that for myself, I have wondered what were the intentions of the Browns. I have wondered, you know, as far as anybody knows, Stringbean and Estelle had never made any enemies, and I don't see anything in their lives to suggest that. But I will tell you this. I happen to know enough about human nature to know that nobody's perfect. And, you know, it's a little bit of a stretch to think that, well, I'll say it this way. Could David Akeman in some way have run afoul of Charlie Brown in some way or another that could have precipitated some kind of disagreement that could have escalated to violence or led to violence? Could have. It doesn't mean the Stringbean did anything ugly. But the question of intention, in my mind, you know, one might say, well, why not take the word of Doug Brown that they didn't go there intending to kill somebody and that it all escalated? Why I doubt him, but I would say why believe him? I mean, this is a murderer. This is a guy who had been, by the way, who was also identified as committing robbery, and that was just lost in the shuffle because it was such a small crime compared to this horrible murder. But these were not nice folks, and they're not people to be believed. And it was in their interest to say that they didn't mean to commit this thing. They were trying to get out of trouble. So what are their intentions? That's a long answer. I'm so sorry my answers are so long, but these are very provocative questions, and they're not answered very easily or very readily or very simply or quickly. But the question of intention, in my mind, remains rather open. I don't know the answer to that. As far as my opinion, you know, it's kind of hard to say. I can tell you, you know, I can't give you anything definitive, but deep down, I guess, in my view, I'll say it this way: I wouldn't be surprised if there was intention for bodily harm, to tell you the truth. But I can't prove it. If my life depended on it, it's just looking at it in the year 2023, which, by the way, is the 50th anniversary of the murders. But looking at it from that viewpoint, you know, I guess I have questions about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had hoped to be able to answer all of them, but I feel that they're still there. But there may be people who might have access to things that I don't, or you know, I don't. My hope is that this book will spur people to be interested in, well, not just in the murder, but Stringbean's life and so forth. But you know, there may be people who have better access than I do on some of those things. But they're questions in my mind. Yeah.
So which members of the Brown family served time for this? Are any of them still alive? And have there been any opportunities for you to interview any of them?
Well, first of all, Doug and John were convicted. Charlie was never tried. He, again, did kind of a plea deal, an immunity deal, and he was never tried, even though Peebles, you know, in the trial, essentially accused him of being the trigger man. But the jury, in the end, you know, voted to convict both Doug and John of first-degree murder. They were given life sentences. At that time, the death penalty had been abolished, so that was not an option. That wasn't on the table. The jury members came out saying, we're not really sure what happened, but we're sure that Doug and John Brown were there and that they were involved in the murder. That's about the best they could come up with. Arnold Peebles' defense case was surely one of the worst defense cases in the history. By this time, he was so far gone on cocaine that if you look at the court records, I mean, it's almost disjointed. I mean, it's such a shamefully presented defense case that it was utterly ineffective. And so really, and I think also all those pressures and everybody, I mean, it was a foregone conclusion about the guilt thing. But the jurors came out and said, we're not really sure what happened. But anyway, they were convicted. They were put in prison, and Doug wound up, he became very quiet. He died in a prison in Tennessee that it was actually the prison, I believe the gentleman who killed Martin Luther King Jr., I think, was in prison there at one point. And then Hannibal, the fictional character Hannibal Lecter, was supposed to go to that particular prison, but I think he never did make it. I think he broke out before he wound up there. But anyway, that's where Doug actually ended up living, and he was in that prison. And he passed away there and was buried, I think, in the cemetery, I think on the grounds or nearby. So he passed away. That was Doug Brown. John Brown is alive to this day, and he was actually paroled. It was very controversial parole in 2014. After many, many attempts, he finally was paroled in 2014. I went and tried to make contact with him and talk with him. He was hired on by a very large church north of Nashville, not too far from Ridgetop, actually, a place called the Cornerstone Church. The minister there hires ex-convicts, and John was hired. I went. That was the best way I could figure out to try to talk to him, and I was told that he wanted to move on from this, and which I can understand, of course. I would love to talk to him. I would love to, the story is a great story of redemption for him. He found religion, and he was a model prisoner. He was, by all accounts, had changed his life and has changed his life. And I thought it would make for quite a story to talk to him and to get his side of the story, get his thoughts on it, because I think it's a tremendous story of redemption. But I can also understand that he wanted not to talk about it anymore. As for Charlie Brown, it's my understanding he's still alive. It turns out that I have various family and friends in the Nashville area, and I have heard sort of indirectly about his being alive. And by various accounts, I've heard that it's people who know him believe that he was innocent and made a plea deal and didn't have anything to do with the murder. And so, it's not my place to question them by any means. But my understanding is he's still alive and well. And, I can understand if he doesn't want to be connected with all this. This is all certainly in the past, But anyway, that's my understanding. As far as talking to them, again, I tried to make a connection with John, and who knows, that there may be a time of doing that at some other point.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through this case. I so appreciate it. So you've got a website, correct?
Yes, sir. Yep, TaylorHagood.com. Yes, sir, absolutely. And the book is available. So the book is available on Amazon, of course, and Barnes and Noble, and there are independent bookstores. I noticed seems that Powell's Books has it. There's some places in Virginia. So there's different kind of regional places. I know Barnes and Noble, certain stores carry it, but I think they're mainly in the Tennessee, Kentucky region. So, but anyway, it's readily available in paperback. Usually it's about $19.95, I think, for paperback. Sometimes it gets discounted on Amazon. It's also available on Kindle. And there is a hardback edition, but it's what they call a library edition. So it's printed on the cover. The cover, like the hardback cover, is printed, and it's mainly to stand up to the wear and tear for libraries. I know there are a number of libraries that have it, so it should be available there. And then there's talk of maybe having an audio version coming out at some point. So I don't know quite where things stand with that at this stage, but it may be available in audio form at some point.
Cool. Well, gosh, thank you again.
Oh, thank you. Listen, I really mean it. I want to tell you again how much I appreciate all of your work and everything you're doing, and this to be a part of this program means a tremendous amount to me. And I hope that I guess I would like to say that probably my biggest hope is that people will read about Stringbean, read about his life. It's one of the great lives, I think, of somebody who remained humble and remained didn't get above his raising. And even though he enjoyed great fame and a measure of wealth, he stayed very true to his roots. And I think he's, in that sense, somebody to be admired. And he had some very interesting things he was doing with his music. We didn't necessarily talk about that much, but he does some very interesting things with his music. And he's somebody, I think that I think it's an interesting story. And of course, I think the trial and the investigation and the murder of the trial and so forth are there. But above all, I hope people can, rediscover Stringbean's music if they've never heard of him, and see kind of the joy that he brings, because it's American roots music, and it's music that's very inviting in a lot of ways. And I hope that his star can continue to rise. It's an unfortunate thing. Not only is it a terrible thing that he was murdered, but it's an unfortunate thing that his life should have ended the way it did, because I think had he lived, he would have gone on to be remembered as being one of the legends of country music, along with his friend Minnie Pearl or Loretta Lynn or whomever, all those people. He was one of those legends. So I hope that will be something that can come from this for him.
Once more, I have been speaking to Taylor Hagood. He is author of the book Stringbean, The Life and Murder of a Country Music Legend. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.